All right. Can you hear me out there? Okay. Good evening. I'm Hugh West, Chair of the History Department, and I want to welcome you to this, which is the first of two of this year's Douglas Southall Freeman lectures by George Herring, both of them on the Vietnam War. As ever, we all extend our warmest thanks to the Freeman family, represented by Mary Tyler McClanahan, in the audience, whose magnificent gift has made this professorship and the annual lectures possible. Over the years, I've set myself a little game of trying to draw connections between the eminence for whom these lectures are named and the incumbent in the chair on a year-to-year basis. And I thought this little game was going to be hard this year because Douglas Southall Freeman dealt with the 19th century and our current incumbent deals with the 20th century, but it turned out to be astonishingly easy to play this little game. So as a way of reminding us both of the remarkable Dr. Freeman and introducing our speaker, let me tell you some of the parallels I found between Freeman and Herring. Each was or is a Virginian of the Southwest persuasion, Dr. Freeman hailing from Lynchburg and Dr. Herring from Blacksburg. Each attended a distinguished liberal arts college in Virginia, Freeman the University of Richmond and Herring Roanoke College. Each proceeded to his doctorate at maybe lesser institutions, but mid-Atlantic institutions, Freeman to Johns Hopkins and Herring to the University of Virginia. Each worked his writing around a busy schedule of trying to make the world run right, although I don't think George Herring can claim quite the legendary schedule of Douglas Southall Freeman, which involved rising at 2:30 a.m. To get the Richmond News Leader out and a few radio talks in before he sat down to do his writing in the afternoon. But I do note in looking at George's CV, 10 years, that's 10 years as chair of the department, history department at the University of Kentucky, and myriad, shall we say, practical contributions to the profession, to his university, to the state of Kentucky, and to the nation. Each, I go on, sought to convey the results of his scholarship to a non-academic audience. Both of them, for example, did their best to write intelligible, even artful prose. Both of them made use of the new mass media to convey lessons of history to their audiences. In the case of Freeman, there were his famous radio broadcasts on every topic under the sun. And in George Herring's case, his contributions to various documentaries on the Vietnam War. But most important of all, and this is the punchline, each of them devoted or has devoted the better part of his scholarly energy to dispassionate study of one of the two, it seems to be, most violent, costly, baffling crises in our national identity. For Freeman, the Civil War, and for Herring, the Vietnam War, were the wars that, well, to coin a phrase, wouldn't go away. And they wouldn't go away in two senses, it seems to me. One is that somehow or other, these two fellows couldn't give up the subject. Freeman set aside a biography of Washington after he'd written his biography of Lee to write about Lee's lieutenants because, and I quote him, mentally, he says, it was not easy to leave the struggle about which one had been writing for 20 years and more. And if you look at George Herring's introduction to his book on LBJ and the Vietnam War, which he recently wrote, he says almost the same thing. I had other projects, but I couldn't get away from the damn thing. And one reason for this, it seems to me, are that they are wars that won't go away in another sense. It's that these wars won't go away because they're too much about baffling, complex, and important struggles on the part of our nation to decide who we are as a people. Well, this fall will mark the 100th anniversary of Douglas Southall Freeman's entry into the University of Richmond. George Herring is our 10th Freeman professor. 110, those numbers sound pretty auspicious to me. So please join me in welcoming George Herring, our 10th Douglas Southall Freeman Professor, to speak about his particular war that just won't go away.
Microphones. Thank you, Hugh, for that very kind and immensely flattering introduction. To be put in the same league is very flattering and humbling. Although I can assure you I've never written at 2:30 in the morning. I do think about it at 2:30 in the morning. And the output comparatively bespeaks that, I think. The last time I spoke on this campus, it was May 23rd, 1985. It was an auditorium larger than this, and there were about a dozen people. About half of them my family and friends. I attributed it to bad publicity rather than the drawing power of myself and the several other speakers. I'm happy and proud to say that once again tonight I have lots of family and friends here, but there are a lot of other folks, and I thank you all for coming, and for the students in particular, I hope the incentives are good ones, and I hope beside that you get something out of this. I'd also like to thank my colleagues in the history department at the University of Richmond for inviting me to hold the Freeman Professorship this spring. I grew up in Virginia. I'm old enough to remember Douglas Southall Freeman. I am honored and again humbled to wear that title for a brief period. And I should add that Dottie and I are really thrilled to be here in Richmond for these 4 months, connecting with family, getting reacquainted with old friends, and I think most important, making new friends among colleagues at the university and students here. So thanks for inviting us, and thanks to all of you for the splendid hospitality. We look forward to the next 8 weeks. It's hard to believe it's going so fast. 10 years ago this month, at the end of the Persian Gulf War, President George Bush, now one has to say the elder, exulted that the ghost of Vietnam had been laid to rest beneath the sands of the Arabian desert. Now, of course, what he was saying here was that America's smashing success in the Persian Gulf War had finally overcome popular fears left over from the war in Vietnam of using military force abroad. By God, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all, he proclaimed on another occasion. Now, like the rumors Mark Twain once jokingly reported of his own death, President Bush's eulogy for the so-called Vietnam syndrome turned out, I think, to be greatly exaggerated. Indeed, we now know that just days before he spoke, he had refused to send his triumphant armies on to Baghdad for total victory in the Gulf War, in part at least, because out of fear of getting sucked into a political and diplomatic quagmire like Vietnam. Debates over possible U.S. intervention in Haiti and in Bosnia in 1993-94, the disastrous involvement in Somalia in 1993 called forth once again the very ghost President Bush claimed to have buried. President Clinton's normalization of relations with Vietnam in 1995 formally and finally ended the Vietnam War, laying to rest at least some issues. But I would argue that just beneath the surface, that war continues to haunt us, it continues to perplex us, as I think the war 2 years ago in Kosovo made very, very clear. Such is its staying power, its hold on the national psyche, that I call it the war that never seems to go away. And the question I ask tonight is, why is this so? Why has a conflict that ended for the United States more than 25 years ago, why does it continue to trouble us in this way? Why is it the war that never seems to go away? These are questions that have intrigued me, kept me occupied for a number of years now. They're questions, I think, that are particularly difficult to answer for this generation of students. Born now in the early 1980s, it's hard for me, I have to remind myself every day, which has no memory of the war and little information except what might be gleaned from the grossly distorted lenses of television and film. And so what I'd like to try to do tonight is to explain as best I can this phenomenon, to pose some answers to the questions that I've raised. The first point I would suggest is that Vietnam was America's longest war. Our involvement there spanned a quarter of a century, from 1950 to 1975. From 1950 to 54, in the name of containing communism, we assisted the French in fighting a communist-led nationalist insurgency in Vietnam, ultimately paying something like 80% of the cost of their war. From 1954 to 61, after the French had departed, we sought to construct in the southern part of Vietnam an independent, non-communist nation that could stand as a bulwark against further communist penetration of Southeast Asia. It goes on and on. From 61 to 65, we assisted the South Vietnamese in fighting an insurgency backed by North Vietnam. The real shooting war for the United States, of course, began in 1965 and continued to 1973, 1 year longer than the American Revolution. And I think the length of the war is of much more than passing importance, more than simply more of those dates in a history book that at some point we have to memorize. We Americans are an impatient people by nature. We want results and we like them quickly. Our preferred wars are the Spanish-American War, lasting about 4 months, the Gulf War shorter. That wise soldier-statesman, General George Marshall, once observed that a democracy, and he was referring to the American democracy, could not fight a 5-year war. And of course he made that comment during the course of what Studs Terkel has called the Good War, World War II, the one American war that enjoyed near unanimous popular support. And so what this means is that the longer a war drags on, the more impatient we become, the less popular it becomes, and so by 1970, 5 years after the shooting war began, the Vietnam War had become a drag on the body politic, an albatross, something Americans desperately wanted to be rid of. And so I would suggest first that its staying power as a war has contributed to its staying power in our memory. It was also an extremely difficult and peculiarly frustrating war for Americans to fight, fought in a climate and on a terrain singularly inhospitable. Thick jungles, rugged mountains, foreboding swamps and paddies, heat that could kill a man, bake his brains, or wring the sweat from him till he died of exhaustion, Marine Lieutenant Philip Caputo tells us. And he goes on to say that it was as if the sun and the land itself were in league with the Viet Cong, wearing us down, driving us mad, killing us. The land is your true enemy. A Viet Cong officer tells American GIs in veteran Tim O'Brien's classic novel, Going After Cacciato. At least in its initial stages, it was a people's war, where people rather than territory were the primary objectives. But Americans, as individuals or as a nation, could never really bridge the huge cultural gap that separated them from all Vietnamese, not knowing the language or the culture. They didn't know what the people thought, felt, or even at times how to tell friend from foe. Maybe they've got things mixed up, one of O'Brien's bewildered GIs comments after a seemingly friendly farmer smiles and bows and points the Americans straight into a minefield. Maybe they cry when they're happy and smile when they're sad. Recalling the emotionless response of a group of peasants when their homes were destroyed by an American company, Caputo notes they did nothing and I hated them for it. Their apparent indifference made me feel indifferent. And so this cultural gap produces cynicism and even hatred at times towards the South Vietnamese, the very people the Americans are trying to help. We're fighting, dying for a people who resent our being here, one GI complained. And it leads to questioning of our purpose in the war and produces a great deal of confusion among some of those fighting the war and some people at home. Most important, perhaps, was the formless yet entirely lethal nature of guerrilla warfare in Vietnam. A war without distinct battle lines or fixed objectives, where traditional concepts of victory and defeat were blurred. Caputo again, a formless war against a formless enemy, who evaporated into the morning jungle mist only to materialize in some unexpected place. The danger was nowhere, and it was everywhere. We'd be expecting a huge firefight and end up nothing, one GI wrote. And then one day we'd be walking along, daydreaming, and boom, they'd spring an ambush. As many as 1/4 of the total U.S. casualties came from mines and booby traps, an omnipresent reality that was both terrifying and demoralizing. A type of war, it should not be necessary to add, particularly difficult for Americans schooled in the conventional warfare of World War II and Korea to fight. And there was always the gnawing question first posed by John Kennedy himself: how can we tell if we're winning? Pretty fundamental question in warfare. The only answer that could be devised was the notorious body count, the daily toll of enemy dead, as grim and corrupting ultimately as it was unreliable as an index of success. And in time, a strategy based on nothing more than killing enemy soldiers came to represent for some GIs and for some at home killing merely for the sake of killing. Aimless, that's what it is, one of O'Brien's GIs laments. A bunch of kids trying to pin the tail on the Asian donkey, the old birthday party game from at least my generation, but no tail, no donkey. It was a limited war, limited in both ends and means, and that brought special frustrations for those who fought it. The United States never set out to win this war in the conventional sense, in part for fear that winning might provoke a larger war, even a nuclear war. In part because, at least at the outset, winning didn't seem necessary. Possibly it would be counterproductive. Lyndon Johnson sought rather to apply just enough military pressure to find that point where he could persuade the North Vietnamese to accept a permanently divided country. And so, as a consequence, the United States did not fight the war with all the resources at its disposal and fought under restrictive rules of engagement. And of course, the result is extremely frustrating for those who managed the war, for those who fought it, for many people at home, especially frustrating for those in the field, who at times were not supposed to fire unless they were fired upon first, who could not pursue, or at least was not supposed to pursue, the enemy into sanctuaries across borders in Laos and Cambodia, who sometimes understandably felt as though they were fighting with one hand tied behind their back. I'm flying a limited aircraft with limited ordnance and striking limited targets in a limited war fought for limited objectives and with limited popular support, a Navy pilot complained. All I've got is the personal satisfaction of doing my job along with a tangle of frustrations. And yet, ironically, this limited war in times assumed huge elephantine proportions. An all-out limited war, one official called it, without any apparent sense of the paradox. More than 500,000 American troops, the bombing of a small country that in time exceeded the tonnage of all bombs dropped by all countries in all theaters in World War II, 300 pounds of explosive for each resident of North Vietnam, it's been estimated, wreaked enormous destruction in all of former French Indochina, expenditures on the part of the United States that by 1967 are in excess of $2 billion per month. In addition, and maybe most important, it's a war where the balance of forces in Vietnam, I think, were stacked against us, and where success as we defined it and sought to attain it was probably beyond our reach. In seeking to establish an independent, non-communist nation in southern Vietnam, we attempted a truly formidable undertaking on the basis of a very, very, very fragile foundation. The country to which we first committed ourselves in 1954 lacked most of the essential ingredients for nationhood. And I would suggest that had we looked all over the world at that particular time, we might not have been able to find a less promising place for an experiment in nation building. That area of southern Vietnam also torn apart by a whole mess of incomprehensible conflicting forces, political, ethnic, religious, In the words of one scholar, a political jungle of warlords, bandits, partisan troops, and secret societies. And so I think from this perspective, there were probably built-in limits to what we or any nation might have accomplished there. And so for nearly 20 years, we struggled to establish a viable nation in the face of a powerful internal insurgency and ultimately an external invasion. We could never find leaders capable of mobilizing the disparate population. The fact that we had to look for them, I think, speaks volumes about the nature of the problem. We launched a vast array of ambitious programs to win hearts and minds, to promote sound government, in the phrases of the day, to wage war against the Viet Cong. When our client state was near collapse in 1965, ultimately we put in our own troops. But the rapid fall of South Vietnam after we withdrew in March '73 suggests, I think, how little was really accomplished. From beginning to end, we also violated what has to be the first rule of warfare. We underestimated the strength and determination of our adversary. Don't wish to imply here that the North Vietnamese, the National Liberation Front, what we call the Viet Cong, were some kind of super people. They made colossal blunders. They paid a huge price for their eventual victory. They've shown a far greater capacity for waging war than building a nation themselves. And yet again, in terms of the balance of forces at this particular time, in this particular war, they had distinct advantages. Tightly mobilized and regimented, fanatically committed to the achievement of their goals. They employ methods already perfected in their 8-year war against France, a strategy skillfully applied of protracted war, perceiving that Americans, like the French before them, would become impatient, and if they bled long enough, they would weary of the war. You'll kill 10 of our men. We'll kill 1 of yours, said Ho Chi Minh, the North Vietnamese leader, early on. And in the end, it is you who will tire. Actually, he made this comment to a French official on the eve of the First Indochina War. But it could as easily be a commentary on what the Vietnamese called the American War as well. And so I think the circumstances of the war posed a dilemma we never really understood, much less came to terms with in any way. Success might well have required the physical annihilation of North Vietnam, but given our limited goals, this seemed at least a mite excessive. It was obviously at best dubious on moral grounds. It held out the threat of Soviet and Chinese intervention. The war is fought, remember, in the context of the larger Cold War. That posed the threat of a much larger and more dangerous war, maybe even the nuclear war that our intervention in Vietnam was designed to deter in the first place. The only other way is to establish a viable South Vietnam, but given the problems I've noted, the weak foundation, our limited ability to understand the society and culture, this was probably beyond our capacity. To put it charitably, then, we may have placed ourselves in a sort of classic no-win situation. Now, with the exception of the Civil War, which Hugh mentioned earlier, where obviously in that case we're shooting at each other, Vietnam is also our most divisive war. I would inject a caveat here. Dissent in wartime is as American as cherry pie. Among all our wars, only World War II and the relatively brief Spanish-American and Persian Gulf Wars enjoyed near universal support. The Gulf War, remember, only after it was clear that we were going to be successful. We went into that war deeply divided. Still, I think it's fair to say that Vietnam aroused more serious opposition, more widespread and passionate opposition than other U.S. wars. There are a number of reasons for this. It occurred in a time of social upheaval, when Americans were questioning their values and institutions as at few other times in their recent history. It occurred in a time of generational strife, at a time when the verities of the Cold War were being questioned and challenged. And in the face of these questions and challenges, neither the Johnson nor Nixon administrations could ever make a really convincing argument that the war was just or that it was necessary in terms of America's national security. The war thus divided Americans as nothing since the debate over slavery and the Civil War a century earlier. It divided neighbors. It divided colleagues and churches. Campus protest became a way of life, even in time at state and conservative institutions like my own University of Kentucky. It divided class against class. It divided father against son, even among the families of top policymakers, people like Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. I've seen no more poignant example of this than the recent prize-winning book by James Carroll entitled American Requiem, God, My Father, and the War That Came Between Us. The wrenching, in many ways, story of a close-knit Irish Catholic family torn apart by this war. The father, an Air Force general, head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. 3 sons who go very different ways. One, the author, an anti-war priest, a follower of the Berrigan brothers. One brother in exile to Canada. Another, incredibly, an FBI agent whose job, incredibly, is to pursue draft evaders and to infiltrate the Catholic left, in short, to go after his brothers. The father and the author's son split over the war, and they're never really reconciled. A noble man, Carroll concludes, I loved him, and because I was so much like him, I had broken his heart, and the final truth was he had broken mine. A more happy ending is in the case of Dean Rusk, whose son came back to Athens, Georgia after a 15-year exile in Alaska, knocked on the door one day and said, Dad, let's sit down and write your memoirs together and see if that pulls us back together as a family, and it did. As many of you in the audience remember vividly, the war spurred all kinds of individual and group protest. Street demonstrations by the 70s, a common occurrence in most American cities. Teach-ins on campuses, lie-ins at military induction centers. Folk singer Joan Baez refused to pay that portion of her income tax that went to the military budget. Heavyweight fighter Muhammad Ali, recently named the Athlete of the Century, refused induction by the draft and thereby forfeited his title. Numerous Americans burned draft cards as a symbolic act of protest. An estimated 50,000 fled to Canada to avoid service in the war. Some young men, like a friend of mine in Lexington, Kentucky, went to prison for 2 years rather than fight in a war they considered immoral. 5 Americans, copying Vietnamese Buddhist acts of protest, immolated themselves to death in public places. The Quaker Norman Morrison in November 1965 below Robert McNamara's Pentagon office. And as the war dragged on, the protests mounted, the divisions deepened. This internal turmoil, in turn, contributed to a war weariness that came to pervade the nation and fed a desire, even on the part of some of those who approved the purposes of the war, to get out of Vietnam. The protest and disharmony weigh heavily, obviously, on the policymakers and push them ultimately in subtle and sometimes direct ways to extricate the nation from the war. The outcome of the war, itself, of course, traumatic, far and away the most traumatic of all the wars the United States has participated in, leaving a bad taste in the nation's collective mouth, again, I think, contributing to the longevity, the persistence of its influence. It's not entirely accurate to say, as is often said, that Vietnam was the first war America lost. We did not, I suppose, in a strictly military sense, lose the war. We were never really defeated in battle. Our armed forces were withdrawn from Vietnam. They were not forced out militarily. But I think that in itself is important. Huge significance, making the outcome all the more frustrating and all the more difficult to explain and accept. And for those who fought there, for those who supported the war, even for some of those who opposed the war, the departure of that last helicopter from the embassy rooftop of Saigon in April 1975, a glaring symbol of America's failure there, came very hard. I grieved, a Kentucky Army officer told me. I grieved as though I had lost a member of my own family. And for those who had lost children in the war, obviously it was especially painful. Now it's all gone down the drain and it hurts. What did he die for? A Pennsylvanian asked. It was the saddest day of my life when it sank in that we had lost the war, a Virginian added. Ironically, the fall of Saigon came at just that point in the spring of 1975 when we were preparing to celebrate the bicentennial of America's birth, and the irony was painfully obvious. The high hopes and wishful idealism with which the American nation had been born were not destroyed, Newsweek observed, but they have been chastened by the failure of America to work its will in Indochina. And indeed, I think looked at from the longer perspective, over the longer haul, the Vietnam War, as perhaps no other event in U.S. history, caused us as a people to confront a set of beliefs about ourselves that forms a basic part of the American character. And I would suggest that this, perhaps more than anything else, explains why the war has caused us so much pain and why its influence has lingered for so long. The myth of American exceptionalism holds that we are a people apart, a nation distinctly different from other nations. The first of its tenets, what I would call the idea of American benevolence, holds that in our dealings with other people, in general, we have acted nobly and generously. We've not been exploitative or imperialist like our European brethren. When we've had to use force, it's been for good purposes, in pursuit of noble goals. Forgotten or rationalized along the way, of course, are such things as slavery, the slave trade, extermination of the Indians, subjugation of Filipinos. For many Americans, to be sure, the Vietnam War remained from start to finish, in the words of former President Ronald Reagan, a noble cause. But for many others, including some who fought there, many who opposed the war, ultimately some who supported, there was confusion or even, in some cases, revulsion. Some Americans troubled by the fact that their massive power was being unleashed against a small, apparently backward nation. Our traditional sympathy for the underdog sort of turned against ourselves. Others wondering whether, in the absence of any real threat to our security, you could justify the level of destructiveness we were visiting on Vietnam. And from that unforgettable moment in the summer of '63, when pictures of a Buddhist monk engulfed in flames burst forth in our newspapers and on our television screens, questions abounded about the government we supported and the way we were supporting it. Questions which obviously extend to some GIs in the field. To be sure, again, many, probably most, were not troubled. They were sent to do a job, and they did it. But to an extent, and in ways that had not been the case in some earlier wars, many are troubled that what they're doing does not square with their notion of what America's role in the world ought to be. The 1968 My Lai massacre, in which an American company slaughters more than 500 Vietnamese civilians, particularly traumatic in this regard, not because it was typical, I would argue that it was not, but because it raises in the most blatant and cruel and tragic way basic questions about what we're doing in Vietnam, indeed about our very selves. It was a sort of thing that Americans did not do. If this is what the war is doing to us, in a sort of perverse logic, we reasoned, we wanted no part of it. And so Vietnam, by the 60s, the late 60s, I think, had become more than a country or a war. It was a metaphor for what America was or should be. Again, to be sure, many continue to feel that we're doing the right thing, but others go back from Vietnam to discover a pattern of evil deeply entrenched in American history. One of my favorites is a Jules Feiffer cartoon, which suggests a whole lot of things, the generation gap, differences in attitudes, different approaches to history. And it's a guy, 50-something guy, I suppose, saying, when I went to school, I learned George Washington never told a lie. Slaves were happy on the plantation. The men who opened the West were giants. We won every war because God was on our side. But hey, where my kid goes to school, we learn that George Washington was a slave owner. Slaves hated slavery. The men who opened the West committed genocide. The wars we fought were wars for U.S. imperialism. No wonder my kid's not an American. They're teaching him some other country's history. Thus, journalist Arnold Isaacs has concluded, the national argument on Vietnam was really about America's vision of itself, about conflicting ideas on who we are as a people and what we value and believe. That explains, I think, why the deep divisions have lingered in a cultural clash that still reverberates nearly 30 years after the war ended in America's political life, arts, and popular culture. The war also challenges the notion of American invincibility. The conviction we can do anything we set our minds to. The difficult we do tomorrow, it is said, the impossible may take a while. Another view deriving from history, the spectacular, unparalleled record of success the United States has enjoyed, the relative ease with which it conquered a continent, its remarkable wealth, its success in war. Indeed, the late C. Van Woodward once suggested that only another connection, Hugh, once suggested that among Americans only Southerners perhaps had true insight into the totality of the human experience because only the South had endured military defeat. And so at each step along the road to war in Vietnam, despite at each step universally pessimistic estimates of the prospects for success, the United States plunged ahead, certain or at least hopeful that with a bit of luck it would succeed as it always had. In the lands of the blind, one-eyed men are kings, said Dwight Eisenhower in facing one of these occasions in October 1954. And when it did not, it came as a rude shock, obviously, to the national psyche. We're so accustomed to success, we've come to take it for granted. Failure comes hard, especially in the case of Vietnam, where our armies were never defeated again, where we were frustrated by a small, backward, and maybe worse, Oriental enemy. And so in the aftermath of the war, we concocted various myths to explain what otherwise had no explanation. The national will was subverted, it was said, by hostile media and anti-war movement. Nightly exposure, one of the great myths, to the horrors of war on television, turned the nation against the war and forced us out. We failed because we didn't use our military power wisely or decisively. Civilians put restrictions on the military that made it impossible to win. Hence the classic statement of Rambo upon being given his mission to return to Vietnam and go the second round single-handedly, "Sir, do we get to win this time?" However bad the movie, the statement was rich with symbolism and rich with mythology. Or for Doonesbury fans, there was BD's statement several years ago, made to a young Vietnamese businessman mostly interested in making money, when they happened to be seated next to each other on a plane going to Vietnam. We could have won, you know, if we had really wanted to. And so the war ended with most of the basic issues unresolved. Again, I think, perpetuating its influence. Was it a good war or a bad war, a noble cause or essentially immoral? Was it necessary in terms of the national security or basically needless and senseless? Was it a good war waged poorly? Was it a war that could and indeed should have been won, a war lost only by the timidity of our leaders? Or was it a war that could not have been won at a price we were willing to pay? We were as divided on these issues as we were at the end of the war as while it was going on. We remain, I think, deeply and emotionally divided on these issues today. Finally, and maybe most important, the war refused to go away because for 2 decades we refused to let it go away by refusing to make peace with Vietnam. The reasons for this 20-year delay in what came to be normalization are numerous, very complicated. I won't even attempt to begin to get into them here. But I think it's impossible to avoid the conclusion that sheer vindictiveness played a major part. A deeply felt desire on the part of some Americans, at least, to make the victorious Vietnamese pay for having the temerity to frustrate the United States. Bitter and trapped in denial, journalist Joe Galloway observed, we stubbornly refused to make peace with the Vietnamese, even as we mourned the fact that somehow the war wouldn't go away and leave us alone. And so for many more than 25 years, the influence has lingered and it remains pervasive. You can see it in the sheer output of the popular culture. 700 novels by one estimate, 12,000 nonfiction titles, 1,400 personal narratives, 250 films. Last year, 480 courses were taught at colleges and universities across the nation. It can be seen in the experience of the veterans, at first spurned, then widely stereotyped as victims. It can be seen in the so-called syndrome, the national debate each time the issue has come up of whether to send troops abroad. I'll have more to say about that next week, and I would suggest that even when it is not obvious and visible, it lurks beneath the surface. Now, there are many signs, a whole lot of signs in recent years that we're beginning to come to terms with this war. In part, obviously, it's a matter of time. Even for people like Daniel Ellsberg, the Defense Department official who later turned anti-war, leaked the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times, a person whose entire life was consumed by the war, he will now admit that at least he's no longer obsessed with it. No community in the nation, I think, was more affected by the war than Bardstown, Kentucky, a small town of 5,000 people famous mostly for its fine bourbon whiskey, but a town also that lost 17 young men in Vietnam, probably the most per capita of any community in the country. Time helps you forget, said a survivor of the ill-fated Bardstown National Guard unit overrun in July 1969. I'm not sure you ever heal, but time puts it on a back burner. Time moves you on. Numerous positive acts taken towards reconciliation. The memorial in Washington, once denounced as a black gash of shame, has played an instrumental role in the national process of reconciliation and healing. The most visited spot in Washington, a place where healing occurs on a daily basis. And of course, many of the states have built memorials themselves. On a hill in Frankfort, Kentucky, high above the Kentucky River in the state capitol, the names of the more than 1,000 Kentuckians who gave their lives in Vietnam are inscribed on a simple but imposing structure. On the dates of their death, a large sundial casts its shadow over their names. Here, as in Washington, friends and loved ones leave all sorts of personal items, from beer cans, full beer cans, to whatever, to pay tribute to those who were memorialized. Numerous individual acts of reconciliation. Robert McNamara's 1995 Apologia. "We were wrong, terribly wrong," he said, evoked cries of protest from anti-war people on the one side, from veterans on the other side. One thing it seemed everybody in the country could agree on. McNamara was wrong, and he was 20 years late in saying it. Jane Fonda's admission to Oprah last year that her 1972 posing for a picture holding a North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gun was the most horrible thing I could have done, passed almost without notice. More touching and noteworthy, I think, was the scene in Washington, Veterans Day 1996, when Kim Phuc, who was a 19-year-old girl, had been accidentally napalmed by South Vietnamese pilots, and the vivid image of a little girl running down the road screaming in terror and pain becomes one of the most memorable images of a war with many memorable images. Together with the U.S. Air Force colonel and former POW, laid a wreath at the Vietnam Memorial. Another exceptional act from Pete Peterson, Douglas Peterson, once an involuntary guest at the Hanoi Hilton. He returned to that city in 1996 as America's first ambassador to the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. On the 25th anniversary of the end of the war last spring, he went back to the village where he had crashed, embraced the people who had captured him, and they each agreed that they were very glad that they had not shot each other that day when they had the chance to do it many years before. It's clear also that the war has receded as an issue, despite the Vietnam syndrome and the Powell Doctrine. More on these next week. The United States now has thousands of troops scattered in trouble spots across the world. The presidential campaign of 2000, the first in which all of the major candidates came from the Vietnam generation, the war was really no more than a subtext. It's clear now also that most veterans have made their peace with the war. They have reintegrated into society. Now, I may not be very quick, but I get the distinct impression from reading the Richmond Times-Dispatch that former President Clinton is not real popular around here. And I must admit that for those of us who like a lot of the things he did, he can make it very hard to defend him. But I would also argue here tonight that he showed a great deal of courage in seeking to end the war he once vigorously opposed. His visit to Vietnam last December, although it was subsumed sort of, if the election hadn't been messed up in Florida, it would have been much more an event than it was a very important process in the step of reconciliation. The first post-war president to visit Vietnam, he stayed 4 days, longer than is customary for such visits. The government, without precedent really, permitted his speeches to be broadcast over television. He didn't apologize for the war, as some Americans and Vietnamese thought he should, recognizing the obvious explosiveness of such a step. But he did show a rare sensitivity to Vietnamese concerns and feelings. The theme of his visit, it's an important saying, Vietnam is a country, not a war. An obvious fact when you think about it, but something that we Americans in our self-absorption often forget. He empathized in a way that only he can. The history we leave behind is painful and hard, he said. We mustn't forget it, but we must not be controlled by it. He visited a site not far from Hanoi where Americans and Vietnamese were working together as partners, sifting painstakingly through piles of dirt in search of fragments of bone to help identify American Vietnamese. But he also expressed concern, an important thing, for the estimated 300,000 Vietnamese MIAs and provided thousands of pages of American documents to assist in the search. In Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, he drew huge and enthusiastic crowds, shouts of "Hey Bill," a sort of closing of the circle the visit represented. And yet it also made clear that the process of reconciliation among Americans and Vietnamese on the one side and Americans on the other side is far from over. The war has not gone away. Why didn't he go before, some veteran snarled, making clear there's still a divide in that generation between those who went and those who didn't. The Vietnamese insist that the United States should assume greater responsibility for such war-related problems, as the figure is incredible. The estimated 3.5 million landmines still planted in Vietnam, the unexploded ordnance that still takes a huge toll of lives among civilians, the more than 1 million Vietnamese who claim to have diseases or birth defects from Agent Orange. We've offered no more than limited assistance. When Clinton chided the Vietnamese government about its human rights record and pushed it towards greater personal freedom and the opening to globalization, Vietnam's communist leaders charged that the imperialist Americans were once again seeking to impose their will on a sovereign nation. The dialogue in the United States on the 25th anniversary of the fall of Saigon last spring again made clear that the war is not over. The media paid a lot more attention to Vietnam. I think that's a healthy thing. At least in some quarters, maybe we're beginning to look at it as a country, not a war. Also very clear here that the Vietnam generation deeply, deeply divided on what the war was all about. On the one side, a brief example, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, source of his own controversy in these parts the last couple of weeks, lamented the loss from the Vietnam War of the sense of American exceptionalism, deplored the fact that we're now deeply divided on what our values are and the lengths we should go to promote and defend them. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Neil Sheehan, on the other side, arguing provocatively that the United States was fortunate to lose the war. We emerged, he said, a more skeptical people, more realistic about our limitations. To remember Vietnam is to understand that we are not the exceptions to history we once thought we were. Rather, we share a fallible humanity with the rest of humankind. And so the debate is not over, and it will likely continue. Vietnam was a defining event for an entire generation of Americans, a generation just coming into political power. It shapes the way they look at each other. It shapes the way they look at their country and the world. It lurks just beneath the culture wars that so much is made about today. This generation will go to its grave debating Vietnam, a veteran recently noted. Should the question arise once again of using American troops abroad, or God forbid that the troops now abroad should come under fire, I can assure you that the ghost the senior George Bush claimed to have buried 10 years ago this month will rise up once again to haunt his son. Several weeks ago, intrigued me, my favorite president, not Bill Clinton, not George Bush, President Bartlett, also known as Martin Sheen. moderate, liberal, the father knows best of the Hollywood political set, excuse the analogy for older times, confronting the dispatch of troops to Colombia to rescue hostages taken by drug lords, asked his advisor with all earnestness and fitting gravity, "You think we're heading for Vietnam?" As if to prove that life imitates art, seeking to imitate life, this past Monday morning in the newspaper, President Bush the Younger was quoted in regard to Colombia that he shared the concern of those who are worried that at some point in time the United States might become militarily engaged in Colombia. This seems an appropriate place to end tonight's talk and point towards next week's. Also another sign, admittedly a small one, that Vietnam remains a war that never seems to go away. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Sir George is willing to answer some questions. Let me say before we get to that there will be a reception in the North Court reception just up the hallway here afterwards. If you can't get your question in now, you can get it in there over some food and drink.
Yes.
Oh, may I ask you if you have a good feeling for how Lyndon felt in the early stages when he was trying to reconcile the criticism of 1948 when our China policy fell through, and then our efforts in Korea. You seem to have quite honestly jumped beyond that. But can you see what we were like at that time?
Yeah, I think the question was, I think the role played in John Kennedy, I would add, in John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson's decision to up the ante in Vietnam, to escalate, as it was called at the time, to send in more troops and begin to bomb Vietnam. The role played by the fall of China in 1949, the loss of China, we called it in a very presumptuous way, as though China was ever really ours to lose. And also the Korean War. Yes, both of these in a lot of different ways, quite obviously. Johnson, whenever the naysayers, as he called them, or the nervous Nellies, would begin to say, well, Mr. President, I'm not so sure we can do this or that, and I'm not sure this is the right place to make a stand, he would snap back at many of them. I'm not going to be the president who sees Vietnam go the way China went. In other words, I'm not going to suffer the political consequences that Harry Truman and the Democrats suffered in the early 1950s by permitting this to happen. Korea influences them in a lot of ways. It encourages escalation on the one side, but it also limits it on the other, because those vivid memories of November and December 1950 of the Chinese coming across the border and raising the stakes and increasing the complications of the Korean War, these were memories that Johnson slept with every night. He had other images. His other image was that an American pilot, and he was certain this American pilot would be from Johnson City, Texas, his hometown, would drop a bomb down the smokestack of a Soviet freighter in Haiphong Harbor, and that would be World War III and nuclear war. All of these things tortured him. The interesting thing, one of the more interesting things that's come out of the Johnson phone conversations recently declassified is a really powerful statement he makes in May of 1964, in which he forecasts with incredible prescience what's going to happen. 500,000 troops bogged down in a quagmire, stalemate, dissent rising at home, all of these things. He foresees it with uncanny accuracy, and yet he goes ahead, and that's what makes it real hard to understand. I mean, I think, as I suggested here, that always in the back of these people's mind was the notion that somehow we'll muddle through, may not be the right, but somehow we'll make it out of this. Yes?
Clarify this for me, please. My sense is that the real motive for the war was money. It was very profitable. And and the people that made the decision that was the guiding force, and that's what was so demoralizing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that is one argument. It's an argument that you have to make in a big global sense rather than in looking at Vietnam itself, because Vietnam was of no real consequence to the United States economically. We had not been involved there before. I think the ironic thing again is that what becomes the most compelling argument for de-escalating and trying to find a way out in February 1968 after the Tet Offensive is the economic argument. The Tet Offensive occurs about the same time there's a huge economic crisis in the Western world, the run on gold, all of those things. At the time, Johnson's military advisors are saying, let's put in another 200,000 troops. His economic advisors are saying, Mr. President, we have a huge balance of payments problem. We've got enormous economic problems. You simply must get this war under control and get it out. So I'm not sure about the first part. I do know that it becomes very important later on. Yes?
I was just wondering if you could comment on what the cultural legacy of the war has been for the Vietnamese.
Cultural legacy of the war for the Vietnamese. Couple of comments, I guess. One thing you have to remember is I think the figure is 65% of the people now were born after the war ended. No memory of the war, huge proportion. I mean, it's hard to generalize about that generation, but the impression one gets, particularly of those who live in the cities, is that they don't want to hear of the war. They want to get on with the process of building up Vietnam and of sort of integrating themselves into the global culture and buying into American popular culture. That's kind of one of the ironies of all of this. The other part of it is that there has been a large theme in recent novels, fiction, and film, and the disillusionment expressed, and those who are in the process, maybe as we speak, of reading Bao Nin's Sorrows of War, will see this. It's a literature and a film of disillusionment. The promises that kept them fighting for 30 years. For the Vietnamese, I call it our longest war. The Vietnamese fought for 30 years from the independence, Declaration of Independence, September 1945 to April 1975. It's a literature of disillusionment. The promises that were made to keep them fighting for these years were not realized. For some, it's the promise of a better life that's not realized. For others, it's the socialist, the socialist utopia that was being created, and now they've got rampant globalization and all of these things creeping in and undermining, as many of them see it, the fabric of society. So these are the two things that I would suggest as kind of, I'm not sure these are legacies, but they're kind of where people are about the war now. Yes?
Did the collapse of the Soviet Union change the way historians are teaching the war? I guess more specifically, do some historians now make the argument that regardless of how tragic the cost of the war was, that ultimately it ground the communist machine to a halt and contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union?
The argument is made that you can look at Vietnam as a lost battle in a war that was subsequently won, and I think you can kind of make that in a broad way. I think it's much harder to make a direct connection. I'm not, and I'll say candidly and right off the top that I'm not convinced by that argument. There is a more ironic argument that I think is more indicative of the way history works, not as neat and as clean as we would like it to be and think it is. The nation that came out of the Vietnam War with a lot of hubris was the Soviet Union. I mean, as we came out of World War II with the hubris that took us into Vietnam, they came out of the Vietnam War having been Vietnam's belated ally. They come in fairly late. They really don't come in on a big scale till after we escalate on a big scale. But they come out of it with a sense that more than ever the destiny is on their side, and They're on the wave of the first wave of history, and it's this sort of hubris that leads them, or helps lead them, into their misguided adventures in the Horn of Africa and subsequently Afghanistan, which becomes their Vietnam. And so you can argue, I made this argument in Bob McNamara's presence once, and it was interesting to watch his reaction. But you could argue, you know, that by them winning, our failure in Vietnam in that sense encouraged their hubris. We could afford the failure, I suppose, better than they could. Their society couldn't stand the shocks. Now, there are a lot of other things going on contributing to the fall of the Soviet Union. But the argument you're talking about is very much made. The other argument that I've heard Walt Rostow and others make many times is that our presence in Vietnam for all that time helped provide the basis that permitted Southeast Asia to develop and evolve and maintain its independence. Again, I think that one's kind of tricky. Would it have happened with or without? You know, it's hard to say. Yes?
The fact that these wars were so close on the heels of each other, what part did that play in the attitude of the American public?
Which?
World War II, and then quickly Korea,
Yeah.
and then Vietnam.
The question is sort of what is the linkage or the interconnections between World War II and Korea and Vietnam? And they're huge because, and they operate in a whole lot of different ways. The senior officer corps who fought in Vietnam were World War II officers, obviously, those who created the war and ran the war. And many people would say that they bring out of World War II the sort of mentality, I think it goes back much further, it goes back to U.S. Grant, at least the American way of war, very conventional in its thinking. They bring this mentality to Vietnam, and we fight there that kind of war, which happens to be the wrong kind of war. Another interesting and maybe more difficult connection is the fact that the GIs, the Vietnam generation, were fathers generally fought in World War II. They grew up on World War II movies, John Wayne, Audie Murphy, the glories of glorious and bloodless war. Vietnam was a rude shock for these guys. A rude shock for these guys because it was not at all the way war was supposed to be. It was a totally different war in so many different ways. The Munich analogy, you know, clearly is one of the major impelling forces that leads Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, even in some ways Nixon and Kissinger to make crucial Vietnam decisions. The idea that we didn't stand up to the Axis before World War II, therefore we have to do it now. So you can go on in Korea same way as we suggested earlier.
It brings up the point, having been in World War II in Korea, I was so shocked when a sergeant on an outpost had his throat cut. We didn't do that. That wasn't the proper way to behave. And so when I think of the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong, I think of this first image.
Yeah.
The very first thing I saw was a man with his throat cut.
Yeah.
Think of that.
Yeah. Different kind of war. Different kind of war.
Let's carry on this conversation.